Hi, today we'll be talking about paper, building nations through shared experiences, evidence from African football. And this paper looks at whether uh, victories in football, we know it here as soccer in the United States, whether victories in important national level football games contributes to a collective sense of national identity, and then whether that shared collective sense of national identity might reduce ethnic conflict in countries in Africa. So that's the basic idea of the paper, important for development for reasons we'll talk about in a second. Um, well, why is nation building important? A shared national identity, you might think, reduces interethnic conflict. So if you think that one of the main causes of slow growth in African economies is war and conflict, and you think that one of the main sources of conflict is an inability of different ethnic groups to contest for political power through peaceful means, and instead use violence to contest for political power, then you might think that fostering a shared sense of national identity would be a good way to reduce interethnic conflict and then have faster and more sustainable and broader economic growth. Now, fostering this collective sense of national identity might come at a cost, and the cost might be that it raises the likelihood of conflict with other nations. So, and, and, and a nationalism that's too pugnacious, that views itself as superior to other nations, then simply reproduces the ethnic conflicts, but at an international scale. So that's one problem that the authors are certainly aware of with this focus on nation building. We also might think of the other side, though, which is that nations might be more reluctant to go to war with other nations if they do think that the people of those nations, of those countries, share strong senses of national identity. It's a truism that empires and colonial rulers used a tactic known as divide and rule. That is, they pitted one social group, one ethnic group against the other, and that made it easier for them to rule their empires. So if those entities share national identities, then it's maybe harder to use that divide and rule strategy. So lots of interesting issues, especially in political science. Another reason for why nation building might be thought of as important is that stronger nationalism may be correlated with legitimacy of the state and government. Legitimate governments matter for tax collection. Many of you probably pay your taxes without being told to. You pay voluntarily. So in the United States, we think that we have a very high rate of voluntary tax compliance because the government of the United States, the state of the United States, is viewed as legitimate. And this is an important issue because, as many political scientists think, the sense of legitimacy of the national government, the federal government in the United States, has been declining over time, and that decline seems to have accelerated in the last 4 years, and that's costly then for a variety of reasons. So tax collection, of course, is an important one, but just abiding by rules and enforcing rules is another important reason for why having a shared sense of national identity might be important. And finally, this last item, people might derive pleasure from feeling a sense of belonging in an imagined, that should be imagined with a D, an imagined community. The phrase imagined community is taken from the title of a book by Benedict Anderson, one of the classics in the literature about how nationalism was fostered. So we'll come back to our article for today by De Petris, Chauvin, and Durante and Campante on national identity feeling with after football. And what they're going to do is very straightforward, very simple. They're going to get data from the FIFA, the International Soccer Organization, and basically look at how people's attitudes changed from before a match, an important national level match, to after an important national level match. Now, they won't be looking at the same people, so they'll be relying on a quasi-randomization, or what's sometimes called a natural experiment, which is that the people interviewed before the match are very similar to the people interviewed after the match, so it's a random sample. And then the match itself is, in terms of the outcome, is unknown to the people before, unknown to the people after. Well, the people after know what the outcome is. And so the difference between the people before and the people after is basically only due to the match itself, and not to some other thing that might have happened. And so they'll focus on people interviewed just in a short time period, 15 days, a couple of weeks before the match, compared with people interviewed a couple of weeks after the match. And the presumption is that, while of course for some of the matches something else might have happened that would be changing national identity, if you have a large enough number of matches, then basically the outcome of the match is random or orthogonal with respect to all of the other things that were going on in countries in that brief window of time. So that's the idea of the paper. We'll talk about it a little more when we get to the regression specification. So the FIFA provides the data on what the matches were for the various African countries. The Afrobarometer survey, and you can find the Afrobarometer on the internet, see the data yourself. So they ask questions about preferences and attitudes and for politics primarily, and they have consistently asked a question about how you view your identity, basically as an American. And I'm sorry, I seem to have just lost the video there. There it comes. It's occasionally cutting out. So whether you view yourself as an American or as a person of Mexican descent, for example, that would be privileging your ethnic identity. If you see yourself as a proud Polish person versus seeing yourself as an American. So that's the idea translated to the United States, right? We have people proud of their national heritage from their immigrant ancestors, and some of them may privilege that identity over their American identity. So that's the idea. And then we have data on conflict from the ACLED data set. So all this data is publicly available. I encourage you to spend some time looking at the different websites to see what the data that they're actually using. So here's the main regression that they're going to be looking at. The outcome is going to be whether you identify more with the national sense of identity compared with an ethnic identity. And then the variable post is the main explanatory variable. The variable post is whether you were asked this question after a soccer match compared with before the soccer match. And as we note down here in the blue circle, the regression is going to include dummy variables for every country and every match. So basically you can think of this as, I think there were 69 matches. So you have 69 dummy variables and then of course there's 2 countries in each match. So you have double that, so 140-ish dummy variables, one for each country and each match. And the post variable then is whether you're being observed after that match compared with before that match. So basically you're, as I said now, and I'll say it again a couple times, right? Controlling for everything else, controlling for individual characteristics, most importantly, controlling for what country you're in and what time period you're being interviewed in. Controlling for all that, then we can think of the coefficient on post as the difference between the people in a country who were interviewed 15 days, within 15 days after a football match, compared with the people in that same country who were interviewed in the 15 days prior to the match. So the basic idea is compare the attitudes of the people before the match with the attitudes of people after the match. It's very straightforward, right? You can imagine at Santa Clara University, school spirit after a major victory compared with before a major victory. And our intuition says, well, school spirit's probably different if the team wins some NCAA important final or something like that compared with before that final. So that's the idea. So first thing we do, the authors, is make sure that the this post dummy variable is not correlated with some of the underlying characteristics. So we want to make sure we have balance in this data set, that there isn't some reason why systematically the people who were being interviewed after the game, or more perhaps importantly after a victory, that those people are somehow different from the people who were observed before. And there's no reason in the in the survey why that should be the case, but that can sometimes happen, and then that would confound or bias the results. So basically what they do is they run a regression. They run 13 regressions, one for each of these variables here. The outcome variable is a dummy variable, whether you were in the sample that's interviewed after the game or after the victory, and the explanatory variable is whether you're, in the case of the first one, whether you're male. And so we can see the first regression, the estimate of that coefficient is 0.006. The standard error is 0.004. The t-statistic then is the estimate divided by the standard error. So that would be 1.5, which does not cross our normal threshold of 1.96. And so we would say that's not statistically significantly different from zero. That is, we can't reject the null hypothesis that there is no relationship between being male and being interviewed in the post-game period or in the post-victory period. So they do that for all 13 variables and basically find that there is no systematic correlation between characteristics of people and whether they're being interviewed before or being interviewed after. So that's the check to make sure that the natural experiment indeed was a natural experiment, that the people who were interviewed after the game are kind of the same as the people who were interviewed before the game. So then we go to the regression itself. Our explanatory variable is our outcome variable is whether you privileged your ethnic identity over your national identity. So that's a dummy variable with a 0, 1. So if you said, yes, I'm Polish first and American second, then you were coded as a 1 in this context. Or if you said, yes, I'm Mexican first and American second, then you were coded as a 1 in this. You privileged your ethnic identity over your national identity. So that's the outcome variable. Then the main explanatory variable is this post, these various post variables, whether you're observed before or after. So post has a value 1 if you were observed after, and a value 0 if you were observed before. The regressions all include a whole set of dummy variables. And these what are called fixed effects. So which country are you in? Are you being observed for this match or some other match? And then other control variables, individual control variables. So we see we have 37,000 observations for the Afrobarometer. And then we have R-squares of about 0.10, which is actually pretty good for this kind of cross-sectional analysis. So though again, right, is R-square is not a sign that we have a good regression or not. It's just a diagnostic tool. So here's our main results, right? The main result is that being observed after had some small negative effect on ethnic identity. So after a major game, you're more likely to identify with the nation and less likely, so that's negative sign, less likely to identify the ethnic group. What's more important is that that was especially pronounced, the coefficient's about twice as large when your national team won a victory. And it wasn't significant if the game was a draw or was a defeat. So in those cases, there was no enhanced sense of national identity or diminished sense of ethnic identity. So pretty straightforward finding here that winning football matches enhance the sense of national identity. So we might ask, well, what if we replace this dummy variable with a set of dummies for 3-day periods, so D1, D2, D3, D4, instead of just having one dummy variable for whether you're observed after. So we can run that regression. So instead of one dummy variable, now you'd have dummy variables first for the time period before, and then dummy variables for the time period after. And instead of showing that in a table form, we show those coefficients. They show those coefficients in the form of a plot. So each coefficient estimate is here with its confidence interval. And you can see that for the dummy variables for before the match, there's generally, the effect is generally 0. But after the match, you can see that the estimated coefficients are substantially negative and statistically significantly different from 0. So that's the icing on the cake in terms of this estimation strategy, that it appears that the victories did reduce ethnic identification and increase national identification. Then we can look at interaction terms and see whether the effects were different for different contexts. And in particular, the context here might be whether the you might think that the national identity would be enhanced if you won a game against a team that was sort of a traditional rival. Santa Clara University has traditional rivals, and those games are viewed as more important and enhance school spirit. So it's the same way between nations. And indeed, with the interaction term, we see that the interaction term is negative 0.061. It's quite large and statistically significant. So when you win against a rival team, the effect of diminishing ethnic identity is much stronger. Now you can see in the next couple of ones that whether the game is a home game or an away game does not matter. Whether the margin is big or small, the margin of victory does not matter. The number of goals in the game does not matter. It does matter whether you're in a place that has a strong state presence already. So you can imagine if you live in the capital city, then this isn't as important because probably your sense of national identity is already greatly reduced. And if you think about it at Santa Clara, the appropriate thing to think about is what happens to school spirit to members of the Rough Riders the cheering squad compared with ordinary people at the university. And you might think, well, when the team wins an important victory, the Rough Riders don't change their school spirit because they already have really high school spirit. That's why they decided to join the Rough Riders. So it doesn't have a big effect on them. So that's this idea of the state presence, that if you already have a strong sense of nationhood, the soccer victory doesn't matter too much for you. It's people who are living sort of at the peripheries, who are still living in areas where their ethnic identity is really important and matters. They're the ones who see the changes in national versus ethnic identity. So let's continue on. And we have the last part of the analysis, which is at the country level, to look at whether the soccer victories actually reduce conflict. And here they use a different, I'm sorry, my video keeps cutting out for some reason. So here we have a different possibility, which is that a different methodology. So our outcome variable will be whether there's a conflict, and the explanatory variable will be to determine teams that are competing to qualify for the Africa Cup or for the World Cup. And they're sort of in these kind of similar positions. And so whether they win or lose is largely up to chance. Soccer games, as probably most of you know, football games are often very close, and 1 goal, 2 goals wins the game. And so there's a great amount of chance involved. And so if a team wins in this qualifying tournament, it's more likely in some sense that that's kind of random. And so then they're looking at, when teams win for these qualifying tournaments, is there reduced conflict after that? So the outcome variable is conflict, and the explanatory variable is whether you qualified for the tournament and we're observing the conflict in the period after you've qualified. So again, we're comparing, similar to the other setting, we're comparing how much conflict there is before you qualify for the tournament compared with how much conflict there is after you qualify for the tournament. And let's take a look at the results there. So the coefficient that we're interested in is this coefficient on post-qualification, and you can see that it's negative and statistically significant. Moreover, you can see that coefficients on these variables of weeks before qualification are not significant. So this is sometimes called a placebo test. So you say, well, just to check whether my data, is reasonable, this finding is reasonable. You wouldn't expect that if you were being observed before the qualification that should have an effect on conflict, and indeed it doesn't. It's only after you qualify that you see the reduction in the violence. So that's the basic idea of the paper, and the conclusion, as I mentioned, summarizes it all. I encourage you to take a look at the paper. It's a really cool, interesting paper, and well worth spending some time reading and rereading.